Hello again, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So I've been told something that I believe might be a scoop here on stage. I heard that you were just recently knighted, is that right?
That was right, yes, last week in Windsor Castle.
Oh, congratulations on
Thank
that.
you.
Did I call you sir throughout the interview?
You can, yes.
So I wanted to sort of start by giving my understanding of the background of your approach, and you can tell me if I'm making any mistakes along the way. And so, one of the problems that I believe is being addressed by your work is that climate philanthropy is a very small percentage of the total world of philanthropy, something like 2%. And so the work that you're doing is kind of a corrective to that. You have $10 billion to distribute, is that right? And I guess as a starting point, you are now probably one of the only climate knights and one of the most powerful people in climate philanthropy. Is that an accurate assessment?
Well, we're very privileged to be stewards of $10 billion that will be provided as grants this decade. And it's an important decade. It's not just for climate, it's for nature as well. And always through the lens of people.
So the philosophy, as I've understood it, and I've following your work, and I listened to your podcast when you came onto the Zero podcast, is that you are going places where governments feel like it might be too politically risky to go with money. You have ability to distribute your grants there. Are there examples of your work that sort of fit that description of taking a risk that governments don't feel safe doing?
Well, as philanthropists, we have to sort of figure out what our comparative advantage is. We're able to move quickly. We don't have, congressional committees you might be called before. We don't necessarily have so many, journalists that are wanting to trash what we're doing, although they can do that, by the way. So we ask the question always, where can we inject resources quickly, boldly, in a way that will remove barriers from reaching positive tipping points? We run something together with the World Resources Institute called the System Change Lab. That looks at the 50 transitions that need to take place this decade and the next. And we ask the question, how close are they to the tipping points beyond which change becomes irresistible and unstoppable? And then we ask what's stopping them getting there, and that's where we try and allocate our resources. And sometimes, as you say, it's in areas that maybe governments are less keen to go, and the private sector is not willing to go yet. So there's a sort of window of opportunity for us there. So, for example, the work we're doing in the Congo Basin it is risky, but it's worth it because it's one of the 3 great tropical forest areas. It's the only one of the 3 at the moment that is still absorbing very substantial amounts of carbon dioxide. So it's very, very important it be protected.
So when you last spoke to my colleague Akshat Rathi, I think this was January of 2023, and you had $1.6 billion from the $10 billion fund that had been distributed that was out the door. I know much more than that is committed or pledged. Here we are about 2 years later. How far along are you on the $10 billion that you need to shed before the end of the decade?
It's roughly $2.5 billion. So our philosophy has very much been, look, you start by trying things out, and then if they really work, then you scale it. So we're trying to develop some product lines that will then, year after year, deliver. Because, in our line of business, you don't solve something with a one shot. There aren't silver bullets. It's a journey. And so, for example, we're doing work on alternative proteins. We just this year put $100 million into researching alternative proteins, whether plant-based or fermented or lab-produced proteins. You need basic science to some extent to do that. So we're financing 3 major research labs in different parts of the world. But that's just the beginning. So we would expect to stick with that issue year after year and scale it up.
So you take what you learn from the early projects, and that allows you to accelerate the expenditure from the fund.
Yeah, it's sort of like, a little bit of a sort of venture capital approach. Now, what you can't afford to do is just have pilot successes. The urgency is so great nowadays that, anybody can have a pilot success here or there. So even in our first sort of shot efforts, take, say, the Congo Basin, Lots of people working on the Congo Basin, seeing different parts of the elephant. So what we did is say, look, we want to put $130 million to be helpful here. Pick the 10 best institutions in the world and say to them all, look, you are expert in your own areas. We'll give you each, I don't know, 10 million or something like that. You've got to deliver within your own expertise, and you've got to be part of a team with us. And for the first time ever, we work as a team, and that means you have access to heads of state, you have access to major European countries who care a lot about the Congo Basin, and you try and make the whole add up to the sum of the parts. And that's what's really missing at the moment. If you think about the challenges we've got, think about the electricity grid in East Africa, for example. It's a huge challenge. Nobody on their own, the World Bank on its own can't be helpful. The African Bank can't be helpful. What we're missing is what we call a deal team for the planet. What we ought to be doing is saying, for heaven's sake, we are in an emergency, and what we need to do is bring all the players to the table. It's all very well saying blended finance and going to lots of seminars on the subject, but actually you need to get everyone around the table with their sharp pencils and with their checkbooks. And it needs to be done at a senior level. And so that's one of the things that we are trying to introduce in the way we do business.
And do you see less risk-tolerant capital following in your footsteps where you lead the way? Has that been a pattern you've observed so far?
I think so. I mean, for example, one thing we work on with a wonderful group called Allied Climate Partners, led by Mark Galogly and his team at 3 Cairns. The riskiest part of any large investment is the first 2 years. It's when you're designing it and you're bringing it to financial closure. And private companies, for very understandable reasons, aren't keen to do that. So what's happened in the past, which is very good, is that the grant funding, for example, what's called PIDGE in Africa, prepare the project, then sell the project on, if you like. The problem is you can never scale that because there's not enough grant. So what we've done, together with Allied Climate Partners, we put junior equity in, essentially. We take the first loss, and then, quite honestly, sometimes a third of the projects never reach financial closure. We take the loss then. Mm-hmm. But then, if they do reach financial closure, it's sort of pari passu return. So the modeling suggests that we will then be able to rotate the money, revolve the money. Mm. Now, what's it got to do with your question? Well, for the first time ever now, because we put in that first loss, private sector, and in the first instance, like DFCs, the Development Finance Corporations, are willing to come in, put their money in, and before long, private sector money, genuine private sector money will come in. So you're changing the system, if you like. So that's exactly the kind of thing that we like to do.
I want to pause for a moment and just say, as we get towards the end of this, 15 minutes from now, there'll be an opportunity for questions. So if you use the online system and you have questions for Andrew, then I'll be able to ask those. Now, I wanted to talk about 2030, right? It's actually very great that you're here today because my team has been looking at climate goals with 2030 as the cutoff point, which is the same date by which you're meant to deplete your $10 billion. I'm very optimistic about your ability to do that, but based on our work assessing the world's 2030 climate goals, I would say I'm a bit more pessimistic after this. Unfortunately, based on the work we just published yesterday, we're lagging behind on many of the climate goals, which I'm sure comes as no surprise to people who would be here at COP. But so I was hoping maybe I could be the pessimist and you could kind of give me a more optimistic perspective. So, I wanted to look, for starters, at the work you do on biodiversity. You know, my colleague Natasha was just covering the biodiversity COP, which did not come to a successful result. And if you just look at the numbers, the 30 by 30 goal that the world is trying to meet to set aside 30% of the oceans and the land as a protected, just very, very far behind on the numbers. So the money that you're deploying in biodiversity, do you feel like there's a way to sort of shift the momentum towards progress?
Well, first, I didn't know you were going to be talking about this when I read your fantastic article yesterday. By the way, I hope everyone has signed up to Bloomberg Green. It really was a very good article, and I actually agreed with it. It basically says, here are the targets, and we're off track. We do that similar analysis with our system change lab, and of the 50 transitions, only one of them is actually on track.
Okay.
And even that might be dubious right now. So I actually agree with the message.
You're supposed to be the optimist here.
But
remember?
let me be a little more optimistic, starting on the nature side of things. Well, one thing it's important to remember, people say, oh, the Paris deal is failing. Important to remember that the Paris deal, before the Paris deal, we were heading towards a 4-degree Celsius increase in temperature. We're now heading towards a 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius. I mean, name another period of 9 years where that much progress has been made. Remember also the either brilliance or foolishness of the Paris deal, according to your views. I think it's brilliant. It was a very modern system. The idea was, actually, we can't do a textbook system. The textbook, which we tried in Copenhagen back in 2009, the textbook would say the way to do it is how much carbon dioxide can the upper atmosphere absorb? X, gigatons. All right, now let's allocate the gigatons among nations. And if you emit more than you're allowed to, we put you in prison or we tax you or something like that. Well, the world isn't ready for that. The world wasn't ready for that. Maybe one day it will be, but it's not now. So it was a voluntary system, and its brilliance was, in the first round of NDCs, nobody, at least nobody who understood the situation, expected them to be strong enough to solve climate change. They were always going to be suboptimal. The idea was every 5 years, technology prices would come down, the cost of of climate change would increase, citizens would demand more, and so you would start to get that forward momentum. And that is what has happened. Albeit, we didn't understand there are political cycles where suddenly some countries are doing things too boldly and undermining well-being of people in the Midwest or whatever. And so I think we were a bit naive on that regard, but overall it is working, but nowhere near enough. So take nature, for example. We've worked very, very hard to get the so-called 30 by 30. We financed the political lobbying. We were amazed, and we don't take credit for it because many others worked too, when 198 countries or whatever, even the United States, which is not a member of the Biodiversity Convention, agreed to 30 by 30. Now, as you said in your articles yesterday, so far about 17% of land is protected and 9% of oceans are protected. You need to do a whole lot more. That's what we and others are spending a lot of effort right now. Some countries like Colombia, President Duque, before he left office, he said, what is the situation now? Ours is about 20%. Let's immediately go up to 30. He did. And the new government is actually honoring that. And so you're starting to see some pretty interesting things. At the last COP, 16 heads of Pacific Islands agreed that they would manage 100% and they would protect 30%. They're now preparing plans to put those in place. We put $100 million on the table, said if you come up with good plans, we will help finance them. And so we've got to understand the notion of sort of exponential change. As Al Gore always likes to say, things take much longer than you ever hoped for, and then they happen much more quickly than you expected.
So in other words,
so that's where the sort of the exponential part of it is our source of hope.
So the last 5 years don't have to match the speed of the next 5.
Indeed not. Indeed not. In fact, now we should be starting to get into that inflection point where things start improving more rapidly, even with political change.
So one aspect of technology, since you mentioned that as one of the elements that you're looking at that wasn't something anyone was really talking about 5 years ago, that's now very much on the table, is AI. There are other journalists at Bloomberg who are covering the money story with AI or the technology story. Unfortunately for the climate and energy journalists, it's a story of costs and impacts, because there's just an immense amount of energy that's required, and it's often not clean energy. So do you feel like right now that AI is capable of making a positive contribution to climate as opposed to just being a sort of cost in terms of the energy use?
Well, we don't know, but we're experimenting. So we created a $100 million competition, if you like, and we've just got the first round, and we've cut it down from 2,000 odd proposals down to 30. And we're going to give them small grants to start with, and then of those 30, 15 of them will receive bigger grants, 6 months from now, sort of thing. And it's in nature and climate. And, if you read these proposals, we haven't yet finalized the decision yet, but you look at the proposals, it's actually remarkable what AI can do in nature, for example, in recognition. So, for example, small thing, there are at least 8 million species of creatures. We've only actually measured 1.8 million of them. We don't know even how many there are. There could be as many as 50 million. AI can massively accelerate the rate at which you identify new species, and it can massively accelerate the recognition of existing species, and it can help you protect those. And so it can do through sound, sight, and DNA recognition, it can identify almost immediately what a species is. It can identify if this one has not been identified before. It can then figure out what family and what subfamily it's in, and so on. And so that's just one small example, but there are many, many examples. We also asked for proposals on the electric grid. If you take a country like Vietnam, it's actually invested a lot in renewable energy. But of that renewable energy, less than 50% is entering the grid. Why? Because the grid isn't smart enough and the grid isn't strong enough. AI can help you not only make it smarter so you can adapt, but also helps you identify exactly where to make it stronger. So, there are many examples. And another one is we work a lot, as I was saying, on alternative food. What is beef? It's just a whole lot of proteins and other chemicals, if you like. Well, there are 200 million proteins that have been identified. So getting the right combination is unbelievably too difficult for you and me or any scientist, but actually AI can actually sort things through and do millions of computations so that you start moving towards something that's not only as tasty, but it actually chemically is identical to beef, and is cheap or cheaper, so to speak. So yes, we're very hopeful.
And do you? I know the decision hasn't been made, or at least not announced. But when will these AI grants be made? Is it coming up very soon?
Yes, in the next month we'll be announcing these preliminary grants, and then the bigger grants sort of sometime in the spring. Yes.
Now you mentioned Vietnam. Am I correct? You have quite a background of work in Vietnam. Is that right?
Yeah, I lived there for 5 years. I was running the World Bank program there some years ago.
I'm just curious, as someone with that kind of experience, have you seen a big example of change there in terms of the energy transition based on when you were there with the World Bank?
Oh yes, when I went there, there were only, I think, 32% of rural dwellers had access to electricity. Now it's 99.5%. They have electrified cheaply and effectively, faster than any country, but it's through coal. They are very, very good at generating electricity from coal. What they've now agreed to do is to say, actually, we won't go that route anymore. We will go the route of renewable energy. And they invested quite a bit in that. But they say they need help. And the so-called Just Energy Transition Partnership, which the G7 did with them, was to provide them $17 billion. The problem is the money isn't coming from the country. So you've got this fascinating situation where the countries now, the G7, are sort of trying to get the private sector to go in and so on, but basically say, no, the government of Vietnam needs to move its policies. Government of Vietnam is saying, well, actually, we're sort of out on a limb on this because we've made these commitments, we want to honor them, but we need some help. Actually, offshore wind in the north of Vietnam takes quite a lot of design work, for example. We need upfront money, so to speak. So we're now at that fascinating stage where you've got sort of both sides sort of interested, but they're not dancing. It's like a high school dance, with the girls on one side and the boys. And so the trick is, and that's where maybe philanthropy can be helpful, actually. by sort of getting there and making it a little easier.
So I want to borrow hope from you on another topic. We do a lot of work on methane, and it's a place where in the recent COPs, there have been many announcements of bilateral pacts, industry-wide initiatives, and it's one where we're not seeing yet a ton of progress. In fact, I think methane levels from fossil fuel are still near their record levels. Is there work that the fund is doing where you think it might help change that in the next 5 years?
Yeah, yes. So, I mean, we finance something called Methane Sat, which is an environmental defense fund. Satellites just gone up a couple of months ago. It now is just coming on stream for the first time. There are several satellites measuring methane, but this is rather unique. It can measure just the right sort of, if you like, geographical spread, and then other satellites can look in a lot more detail. So yeah, we will know a year from today, we will be able to know in real time exactly where methane is leaking from. And and then we're investing also in okay, what do you do with that data? How do you use it to lobby? How do you inform people? But perhaps a bigger program for us is the second most polluting species on the planet, which is cattle, of course, and they're the second. We're the first, of course, and they're the second because of us. And methane is, as you know, is currently the worst source of climate change. And we're on a path to destruction if we keep eating beef at the rate of growth we are right now. And so it's incredibly important. So we're investing in vaccines that will lower by 40% or so methane from cattle. We're investing in alternative forage mechanisms because the average cattle in Colombia or Brazil has 1 to 2 hectares each. They don't need it. It's just that there's no pasture management. So that's the second thing. And the third, the most important thing is, even though we're not trying to turn everyone into vegetarians, we simply cannot keep eating meat at the growth rates we are now. We would lose the Amazon. We would lose the battle against climate change. And so it's incredibly important that we recognize that we take a long-term view. 50 years from today, we will be eating differently. It will be just as delicious. It will maybe even have the same composition. It will be cheaper. It will be more nutritious, and it will protect the planet.
So one last topic, and then I want to leave it to audience questions. But my team does a lot of work on carbon markets, and I know it's a place where you and the fund are heavily involved. I know the fund supports the work of Science-Based Targets Initiative, which has been such an important resource for us to try to separate out what is a useful carbon offset from stuff that is less effective. And I guess, again, to borrow from your optimism, our work leads me to be somewhat skeptical about the way these things work, at least in a totally voluntary market that we just see over and over again, more empty offsets being sold, the market being taken over by them. Is there a way that you feel like the voluntary market can be a useful force, or are we going to continue to see sort of like low-quality offsets spread?
Every new market goes through phases, and there's always a lot of abuse. My wife comes from Bruges in Belgium, and if you go to Bruges, you can see the first stock market in the world, 13th century. It took us about 700 years to get stock markets where they needed to get. We don't have that time. There is no reason at all why we can't do carbon markets right. We now have 2 standard-setting organizations, ICVCM on the supply side, VCMI on the demand side, run by extremely good professionals, best in the world. And there's no reason at all why we should not, for example, if you are a good company that is honoring science-based targets in scope 1 and 2, and you're doing your very best on scope 3, there's no reason in our book why you shouldn't be allowed to offset, if that's what you want to call it, or compensate for the scope 3, which is incredibly difficult to reduce, and use that to help Indonesia close down a coal plant. Actually, that's perfectly measurable. You know when a coal plant, and you know if there are any others that are going to be opened, so you can have what's called a jurisdictional approach. At the moment, companies, the best companies in the world that might have 300,000 suppliers even if they contact all of those suppliers, it's very difficult for those suppliers to go down to zero on their own scope 2, which would be scope 3 for the big company, so to speak. My daughter, who's an environmental student, last year did an internship with a very major company and was asked to manage this huge database where they looked at 1,000 of their suppliers. They knew the energy use of all of those suppliers, and they had contacted all of them. And a lot of these suppliers in a place like Vietnam, for example, they would say, actually, we'd love to. One, we don't really know how to measure our emissions, but two, we can't get green electrons here. All the electrons that come through the wires are brown. What do you want us to do? So our view is you could absolutely compensate that and help Vietnam on its offshore wind, and then maybe there would be green electrons.
So to me, that actually does make a lot of sense at the level of the green incentive in Vietnam. But is it a problem? Is the incentive structure broken in terms of the companies who might prefer to do an offset rather than something that costs more money, and even to some of the sources who can flood the market with things that look indistinguishable from a truly meaningful offset from Vietnam, greening Vietnam?
Well, there will always be companies that are going to do greenwashing. We can't stop that. I mean, it's free for them to do it. They're doing it now. But there is a growing group of fantastic companies that actually are trying their very best. And they are on track on scope 1 and 2. And they're trying their best on 3. Those are the ones that we want to honor and, if you like, certify under what we call the Energy Transition Accelerator.
Meg, do we have any questions from the audience?
How do we get the private sector around the table as part of the global deal team? At the moment, there are a lot of expectations of the private sector, but they are rarely in the room when the big conversations are taking place.
Well, that's right, but they're willing to be in the room. I mean, the good ones would like to be in the room. And at the moment, the multilateral banks, and by the way, Ajay Banga at the World Bank is doing a great job. I mean, I think he's taken this on as his #1 goal, is to get sort of more leverage with the private sector. But at the moment, it doesn't happen because it's a cultural thing. They come at it from different places. And so when the G7 went to South Africa to do the first JETP, it wasn't even people from their treasury departments. It was people that are good diplomats, but they didn't invite the private sector with them. They didn't invite many of the players that should. So you're right, they're not in the room, but they would like to come. The good ones would like to come into the room. We've got to make it work, because if we don't, we won't succeed.
Time for one more. How do elections such as the recent U.S. election affect your planning and giving in terms of reaching the fund's goals?
It's a good question, one I meant to get to.
Oh yeah. Well, look, if you there's the economics of the last century and there's the economics of this century. The economics of the last century said if you want to deal with climate change, it may be a nice thing to do, but it's going to cost you in terms of competitiveness in jobs and investment. In 2024, it's a very different story. If you care about competitiveness, if you care particularly about longer term or even medium term growth, if you care about jobs, if you care about the future, if you care about your families, then there is no alternative. There is yesterday's way of doing business, there's tomorrow's way of doing business. And the good news is that, we understand that issues of competitiveness and growth and jobs are actually pretty central to what Mr. Trump plans to do. So elections change lots of things, but they don't change the laws of physics.
That's a great, optimistic place to end it. Sir Andrew Steer, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Aaron. Great pleasure.